He was a millionaire heir who expelled his maid in the middle of the night, accusing her of betrayal. 3 years later, she returns by helicopter during his wedding, with a boy whose eyes mirror his own, and a dossier exposing a cruel setup. What was meant to be revenge reveals a medical secret that could destroy an empire or save a life. A story of impossible choices, second chances, and buried truths. Prepare yourself, because this story will make you rethink the true meaning of family. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. Alexander Reed stood at the edge of his balcony, 30 floors above Manhattan, swirling imported whiskey in a crystal glass that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The morning sun glinted off the neighboring skyscrapers, creating a golden kingdom that seemed to bow before him. At 35, he possessed everything money could buy: the penthouse overlooking Central Park, the fleet of luxury cars, the private jet, and the family empire he'd expanded into a global financial powerhouse. Yet as he gazed out at his domain, something hollow echoed within him, something even his billions couldn't fill. He checked his watch, a rare timepiece worth more than some people would earn in a lifetime, and sighed. The board meeting started in an hour, another day of acquisitions and mergers, of showing the world that the Reed fortune hadn't softened in his hands. His father's voice still echoed in his head after all these years. Never show weakness, Alexander. The market smells fear, like a shark smells blood. He drained his glass and turned back toward his bedroom, where the household staff would have already prepared his suit, his breakfast, his life. The soft sound of movement caught his attention as he entered. Elena Vasquez was changing the sheets on his California king bed, her movements efficient and nearly silent. For 3 years she had worked in his home, always present yet somehow invisible, the way he preferred his staff. Today, however, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the gentle way she smoothed the Egyptian cotton, or how the morning light caught in her dark hair. She glanced up, meeting his eyes for just a moment before looking down again. Alexander felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. In that brief connection, he'd noticed her eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber, intelligent and somehow sad. Had they always looked that way? Had he ever truly looked before? She was different from the women who usually surrounded him. The models, the socialites, the daughters of business partners strategically placed in his path. Elena was real in a way they weren't. No expensive perfume masking her natural scent. No practiced lines or calculated laughs. Just quiet competence and a dignity he suddenly found himself respecting. Elena gathered her cleaning supplies, hyper-aware of his presence. Her heart raced as it always did when he was near, though she'd become expert at hiding it. For 3 years she had cared for his home with a devotion that went far beyond professional duty, though he never seemed to notice. She was just part of the machinery that kept his life running smoothly, invisible until something went wrong. Still, each day she took pride in her work, in being close to him, in the small ways she could make his life better even if he didn't know it was her doing. Alexander cleared his throat. She prepared to hear the usual, some minor adjustment to his schedule, a complaint about the temperature of his breakfast coffee, instructions for an upcoming business dinner. Instead, he asked her name. Elena. He repeated it as if tasting something exotic. Had he really never addressed her by name before? The realization disturbed him more than he cared to admit. The moment was broken by his phone. The board meeting was being moved up. He needed to leave immediately. As he strode from the room, the connection snapped as quickly as it had formed, and Elena was once again just the maid, watching him disappear into his world of wealth and power, a world she could clean but never belong to. That night, Alexander returned late, loosening his tie as the elevator ascended to his penthouse. The acquisition had gone well. Another company folded into the Reed portfolio, another victory to report to the board. Another day of being exactly who his father had raised him to be. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, that strange emptiness had followed him through meetings and handshakes and congratulations. The penthouse was quiet when he entered, the staff gone for the evening. Only the night security remained, stationed discreetly by the service elevator. Alexander poured himself another whiskey and wandered through the immaculate rooms, suddenly aware of how silent his kingdom was. $60 million of real estate, and not a single corner felt like home. He found himself outside the staff quarters, a part of his own residence he rarely visited. What had brought him here? The memory of brown eyes with flecks of amber? He was being ridiculous. Yet he lingered, noticing a soft light under one door. Elena was still awake. What did she do when she wasn't serving his needs? Did she have family? Friends? Dreams beyond these walls? Alexander returned to his bedroom, troubled by questions he'd never bothered to ask before. On his nightstand sat a small bowl of mints, his favorite kind that he kept running out of. He always assumed the household manager restocked them. Had it been Elena all this time? He popped one into his mouth and felt a strange gratitude for this small, thoughtful act from someone whose name he'd only just bothered to learn. As weeks passed, Alexander found himself noticing Elena more and more. The careful way she arranged his books after dusting them, returning each to exactly the right place. How she always seemed to anticipate when he would be working late and left the perfect small meal that could be easily reheated. The fresh flowers she placed in his office. Never showy arrangements. Just simple blooms that somehow made the space feel less sterile. He began to time his mornings to coincide with her cleaning schedule, manufacturing reasons to be in whatever room she was tending to. Their conversations were brief at first. Polite questions about the household, the weather, nothing personal. But gradually, something shifted. He found himself telling her about a difficult negotiation, watching her listen with genuine interest. She mentioned her sister's children in Houston, how she sent half her salary to help put them through school. Small glimpses into each other's worlds. Elena knew she was walking a dangerous line. The other staff had noticed the change in Mr. Reed's behavior, the way he sought her out. Some were suspicious, others warned her to be careful. Rich men didn't see women like her, not really. She might be a momentary curiosity, but crossing invisible boundaries could cost her the job she desperately needed. Yet each small conversation, each moment when he actually saw her, made it harder to maintain her professional distance. For Alexander, these brief interactions became bright spots in his carefully controlled life. Elena's perspective was refreshingly honest, unclouded by ambition or advantage. She spoke carefully at first, then with growing confidence as he encouraged her opinions. She was smarter than he had expected, well-read, despite limited formal education. He found himself bringing home books they had discussed, leaving them where she would find them, a silent invitation to continue their conversations. He told himself there was nothing inappropriate about their growing friendship. She was his employee, yes, but he wasn't his father. The notorious tycoon who had cycled through 3 wives and countless affairs, treating people as disposable assets. Alexander had always prided himself on being different, more ethical. He wasn't crossing any lines. He was just being kind to someone who deserved recognition. But on a stormy evening when the power briefly went out in the building, Alexander found Elena in the kitchen, illuminated by emergency lights as she replaced batteries and flashlights. Something about the intimate darkness, the momentary suspension of normal rules, emboldened him. He asked about her life before coming to work for him. Her story emerged in quiet pieces. Her childhood in a small town in New Mexico. Her dreams of becoming a teacher derailed by family obligations. Her journey to New York seeking opportunity. The sacrifices she'd made. The loneliness she sometimes felt in a city that hardly seemed to know she existed. Alexander listened, really listened, and something shifted inside him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers as he took a flashlight from her hands. The contact was brief, seemingly accidental, but the electricity that passed between them had nothing to do with the storm outside. Their eyes met in the dim light, and for a moment, neither moved. The power returned with a hum, breaking the spell. But something had changed. Something that couldn't be undone. Elena lay awake that night, her mind replaying every moment, every word, every look. She wasn't naive. Men like Alexander Reed didn't fall for women who cleaned their homes. Whatever was happening between them existed in a bubble that would inevitably burst. And yet, her heart wouldn't listen to reason. For the first time since coming to work in the penthouse, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if the distance between their worlds could somehow be bridged. Alexander, too, found sleep elusive. His carefully constructed life had never included space for genuine connection. Relationships were strategic alliances. Physical needs met with women who wanted his money and status as much as he wanted their beauty and discretion. Nothing messy, nothing real. But Elena had somehow slipped past his defenses, making him question everything he had accepted as normal, making him want something he couldn't name. The next morning, Elena was changing flowers in the main living room when she heard voices from Alexander's office. The door was ajar, and though she knew she shouldn't listen, something in the tense tone made her pause. Victoria Ashford, Alexander's executive assistant and rumored former lover, was speaking urgently. Elena had always been intimidated by Victoria, her sleek blonde perfection, her obvious place in Alexander's world of wealth and privilege. Now her words drifted clearly into the hallway. Victoria was warning Alexander about rumors at the company. People were talking about his sudden interest in a household employee. It looked bad, she said. Inappropriate. His father would never have been so indiscreet. The board was already questioning some of his recent decisions. He couldn't afford another reason for them to doubt his judgment. Elena didn't stay to hear Alexander's response. Shame burned through her as she retreated silently. Of course, Victoria was right. Whatever she had imagined was growing between them was nothing but a wealthy man's boredom, a temporary diversion. She was a fool to have thought otherwise. For days afterward, Elena made herself scarce whenever Alexander was home. She rearranged her schedule, finished her work in his private rooms while he was at the office, became once again the invisible presence that kept his life running smoothly. It was better this way. Safer. Her heart would recover eventually. But Alexander noticed her absence immediately. The penthouse felt emptier somehow, the silence no longer peaceful but oppressive. He told himself it was for the best. Victoria's warning had been reasonable from a business perspective. He had responsibilities, expectations to meet. His personal feelings couldn't matter more than the company that employed thousands, the legacy his father had entrusted to him. Yet he found himself lingering in the kitchen in the evening, hoping to encounter her, returning home for lunch with transparent excuses, even calling the household manager with invented concerns, just to confirm Elena was still working her usual hours, that she hadn't left his employ. Finally, on a Sunday morning when he was usually at the gym, Alexander deliberately stayed home. He found Elena in the library, carefully dusting his collection of first editions. She startled when he entered, nearly dropping the book in her hands. The distance between them felt vast now, the easy connection of recent weeks replaced by awkward formality. Elena kept her eyes down, addressing him as Mr. Reed once again. Alexander felt a surprising pain at the reversion. He hadn't realized how much he'd treasured hearing his first name in her voice. He asked why she was avoiding him. Elena denied it at first. Then, when he pressed, admitted she had overheard Victoria's concerns. She understood that their friendship had been inappropriate. She apologized for forgetting her place. Her words, delivered in that soft, dignified voice, filled Alexander with an unfamiliar anger, not at Elena, but at the invisible barriers that defined their interaction, at Victoria's interference, at himself for caring what others thought. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from Philip Harrington, his closest friend and legal counsel for Reed Enterprises. Urgent business matter. Need to discuss immediately. Alexander hesitated. For the first time in his life, the company seemed less important than the conversation he was trying to have. But years of conditioning won out. He told Elena they would finish this discussion later, and left to call Philip, unaware that the interruption had only reinforced her certainty that she would always come second to his real life. Philip's urgent matter turned out to be both professional and personal. The company was negotiating a delicate merger with a Japanese conglomerate, one that would give Reed Enterprises a foothold in Asian markets they had long coveted. The deal was nearly final, but the traditional Japanese executives had expressed concern about Alexander's bachelor status. At 35, his unmarried state suggested instability to them, a lack of proper family values. Philip had a solution. His younger sister, Sophia, had recently returned from Europe after a broken engagement. She came from the right family, had the appropriate education and social standing. A strategic relationship, culminating in an engagement announcement before the merger finalized, would reassure their Japanese partners and smooth the way for the deal. Alexander balked at first. He had known Sophia casually for years, a beautiful, sophisticated woman who moved in the same elite circles. Under normal circumstances, she would have been exactly the type of wife his position called for. But now the suggestion left him cold. Philip pressed harder. The merger was worth billions. The board was watching Alexander's every move since some questionable decisions had cost them a government contract last quarter. His father's legacy was at stake, and Sophia understood the arrangement. A marriage of convenience that would benefit them both. She would have the security and status she desired. He would have the corporate wife he needed. Many of their peers had made similar arrangements. Alexander agreed to think about it, but as he hung up, his thoughts returned to Elena, to genuine conversations and understanding brown eyes, to the strange feeling that the wealthier half of his life was somehow the emptier one. Over the next few weeks, pressures mounted from all sides. The Japanese executives were visiting soon. The board was growing restless about the delayed merger. Philip arranged a dinner with Sophia, who was as lovely and appropriate as advertised. She understood the rules of their world perfectly, knew exactly what was expected of a potential Mrs. Reed. She would be an asset, everyone agreed. The ideal solution. Alexander went through the motions, taking Sophia to the right restaurants, bringing her to company events, playing the part that had been scripted for him since birth. She was pleasant company, intelligent and well-versed in the social niceties his position required. On paper, the arrangement made perfect sense. But at home, in the quiet moments between public appearances, his eyes still sought out Elena. Their interactions had become painfully formal again, yet he couldn't help noticing the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them anymore. Was she suffering as he was? Did she feel this same strange disconnection between what life demanded and what the heart wanted? The confusion Alexander felt only intensified when he began finding small things missing from his rooms. At first, it was just a platinum cufflink, easily misplaced. Then a small amount of cash from his dresser drawer. A silver letter opener from his desk. Nothing valuable enough to report, but the pattern was troubling. The household had operated with impeccable honesty for years. Why would someone start taking things now? Victoria was the one who planted the first seed of suspicion. Over lunch, discussing household matters, she casually mentioned how staff like Elena often became resentful when they realized the boundaries of their position. Perhaps she had gotten the wrong idea about their relationship, and now felt entitled to more. It happened all the time in households like his. The help becoming too familiar, forgetting their place. Alexander dismissed the suggestion immediately. Elena wasn't like that. But the next day, when his mother's antique watch disappeared from his bedside table, a piece with both sentimental and considerable financial value, doubt crept in. Only the household staff had access to his private rooms, and Elena was the one who cleaned them most frequently. He didn't want to believe it. Everything he had come to know about her character argued against such petty theft. Yet the evidence was mounting, and with it, a creeping suspicion that perhaps he had misjudged her entirely. Had their connection been genuine, or had she been playing him all along, taking advantage of his uncharacteristic openness? Alexander hated how easily doubt took root, how quickly he defaulted to suspicion rather than trust. It felt like his father's voice again. Everyone wants something from you, son. No one sees you, only your money. But he couldn't ignore the missing items, the coincidental timing, the fact that Elena was often alone in his rooms. The final straw came when Alexander returned early from a business dinner to find Elena in his office, at his desk, hurriedly closing a drawer as he entered. The look on her face, a flash of what seemed like guilt before her features composed themselves, hit him like a physical blow. He asked what she was doing there so late, why she was at his desk instead of cleaning. Her explanation about replacing stationery sounded hollow to his suspicious ears. That night, after Elena had gone to her quarters, Alexander searched his office. Nothing seemed missing, but he found something unexpected. A small notebook hidden beneath a stack of papers in the drawer she had been closing. Inside were notes in Elena's handwriting, detailed observations about his schedule, his business associates, private phone numbers and addresses. Information that went far beyond what her position would require. Cold anger replaced confusion. He had been a fool, letting down his guard, believing she was somehow different. Whatever her game was, corporate espionage, planning some kind of extortion, perhaps working for a competitor. It ended now. The next morning, Alexander called Elena to his office. The warmth that had characterized their interactions was gone, replaced by icy formality. He placed the notebook on the desk between them and watched her face pale. Without letting her explain, he laid out the evidence against her. The missing items, her presence in his office, the suspicious notes. His voice grew harder with each accusation, feeding on her stunned silence. Elena finally found her voice, tried to explain that the notebook was just her way of keeping track of his preferences, of doing her job better. The missing items weren't her doing. She would never betray his trust that way. Tears filled her eyes as she realized he had already convicted her, that nothing she could say would change his mind. Alexander cut her off mid-sentence. He had wanted to believe in her, he said. Had even thought there might be something special growing between them. Clearly, he had been mistaken. She was terminated immediately and would be escorted from the building. Her final paycheck would be reduced by the value of the stolen items. Elena stood frozen, dignity warring with desperation. There was something she needed to tell him, something important that couldn't wait. But Alexander was done listening. He called security to escort her out, refusing to look at her as she begged for just 5 minutes of his time. Her voice broke as she was led away. one last plea floating back to him. "Please, Alexander, you need to know." But the heavy door closed behind her, cutting off her words. Alexander stood alone in his office, telling himself he had done what was necessary, protected himself from someone who had clearly been using him. Yet victory felt strangely like loss, the penthouse emptier than it had ever been as Elena's belongings were packed and removed, all traces of her erased from his life. That night, a fierce summer storm lashed against the penthouse windows. Alexander stood watching the rain, a familiar emptiness expanding inside him. He had called Philip earlier, agreeing to the arranged relationship with Sophia. The merger would proceed as planned. His life would continue on its predestined course. It was better this way. Safer. His father would have approved. From his pocket, he withdrew the small notebook that had been the final evidence against Elena. He had intended to have it investigated, to discover who she might have been working for. Instead, he found himself opening it, reading more carefully the notes he had only glanced at in his anger. Mr. Reed prefers his coffee black in the morning, with 1 sugar after lunch. Remember fresh mint in the bedroom? Helps him sleep when deals are stressful. Blue tie with the gray suit for board meetings. His lucky combination. Birthday coming? Find something meaningful, not expensive. Maybe related to that book on architecture he mentioned? Page after page of small observations, tiny details about his preferences and needs. Not the notes of a spy or a thief, but of someone paying attention. Someone who cared. Someone who saw him. Doubt crept in where certainty had been. Had he made a terrible mistake? The timing of the thefts, Elena's access to his rooms, it had all seemed so obvious. But what if he had been wrong? What if someone else was responsible? What had she been trying to tell him in those final moments? Alexander reached for his phone, then stopped. Even if he had misjudged her, the damage was done. He had accused her, humiliated her, thrown her out without a proper investigation. His pride wouldn't let him admit such a grievous error. And there was Sophia now, the merger, the expectations of the board. He had made his choice. He closed the notebook and placed it in his desk drawer, locking away both the evidence and his doubts. Outside, the storm continued to rage, washing away the last traces of Elena Vasquez from his life. Or so he thought. Alexander did not know that as Elena was escorted through the rain to a waiting taxi, clutching her hastily packed belongings, she carried with her a secret that would change everything. A truth she had discovered just days before her dismissal. One she had been working up the courage to share. A secret that grew inside her. A tiny flicker of life created during a single night of connection that had meant everything to her, and perhaps nothing to him. Now, cast out and alone, Elena placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach. Alexander might have rejected her, but she would protect this child with everything she had, even if its father never knew it existed. 3 years passed like turning pages in a book, some chapters lingering, others rushing by in a blur. Alexander's life proceeded exactly as planned. The merger with the Japanese conglomerate doubled Reed Enterprises' value. His engagement to Sophia Harrington was announced in the Wall Street Journal, accompanied by a professional photograph of them looking precisely like what they were. A power couple created by strategic design rather than passion. Their wedding was scheduled for June, an elaborate affair already being planned by Manhattan's most exclusive event coordinator. Everything was perfect. Everything was empty. Alexander threw himself into work with renewed intensity, expanding the company into new territories, making bolder acquisitions. His reputation for ruthless efficiency grew. Board members who had once questioned his judgment now deferred to him without hesitation. He was becoming the man his father had groomed him to be. Respected, feared, isolated on his throne of wealth and power. At night, in the silence of his penthouse, now redecorated by Sophia's chosen designer in elegant neutrals that reflected nothing of his personality, Alexander sometimes took out the small notebook he had kept. Elena's careful observations of his preferences, her attention to details no one else had ever noticed. He told himself he kept it as a reminder never to be so easily fooled again. But in truth, it was the only evidence that someone had once seen him as more than the Reed fortune. Had once cared enough to notice he stirred his coffee 3 times, always clockwise. Had recognized the way he rubbed his left temple when stressed and would leave lavender oil by his bed, knowing he would never ask for it but would use it if it appeared. Of Elena herself, there had been no trace. She had vanished from his life as completely as the missing watch and cufflinks. Alexander had hired private investigators to find her after 6 months of growing doubt. but she had disappeared from New York entirely. No employment records, no rental agreements, no social media presence. It was as if Elena Vasquez had ceased to exist the moment she left his building that rainy night. Sofia didn't love him. They both understood their arrangement perfectly, but she played her role with precision. She redecorated his homes, organized the right charity events, charmed his business associates. She never asked about his distant moods or the way he sometimes stared at nothing. Their physical relationship was as scheduled and efficient as board meetings. A necessary function rather than a connection. It suited them both. Almost. Late at night, when his fiancée was asleep in her separate bedroom, Alexander sometimes stood on his balcony and wondered about the life he might have had if he'd made different choices. If he had trusted, rather than accused. If he had been brave enough to want something his father wouldn't have approved of. But those thoughts were indulgences he couldn't afford, weaknesses that had no place in the life he had chosen. As June approached, wedding preparations accelerated. The date was set, venue secured, invitations sent to 600 of New York's elite. Alexander went through each motion with perfect outward composure. The business newspapers praised the upcoming union of the Reed and Harrington families as the merger of the season. The board was pleased. Sofia was satisfied. Only Alexander felt the hollowness of it all, the sense of something essential missing from the elaborate production his life had become. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself had been bribed to cooperate. Alexander stood in his dressing room, adjusting his custom-made tuxedo, as his best man and future brother-in-law, Philip Harrington, poured champagne. Philip was discussing the latest company acquisition, barely distinguishing between business strategy and wedding preparations. Both were transactions to be navigated for maximum advantage. Wedding guests were already arriving at the Plaza Hotel, where a ballroom had been transformed into a vision of crystal and white roses. A string quartet played as New York's wealthiest and most powerful were escorted to their assigned seats. Society photographers documented every moment, every important arrival. The Reed-Harrington wedding was the event of the season, a coronation of America's newest royal couple. Alexander felt nothing as he took his position at the altar, watching the ornate doors for his bride's entrance. This was what he had chosen, what was expected, the path laid out for him since birth. He took a deep breath, steadied himself for the performance of contentment everyone was waiting to witness. The string quartet shifted to the wedding march. Guests rose from their seats, turning toward the doors. They opened to reveal Sofia, radiant in a designer gown that had cost more than most people's homes. She began her perfectly timed walk down the aisle, her father beside her, every step choreographed for the photographers capturing the moment. Alexander prepared his practiced smile, the one that would appear in tomorrow's newspapers and convince the world of his satisfaction. But as Sofia reached the midpoint of the aisle, a sound cut through the music, the unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades, growing louder by the second. Guests began to murmur, glancing toward the ballroom's high windows. The noise intensified, drowning out the string quartet, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers. Security personnel moved quickly toward Alexander, communication devices at their ears. One leaned in to inform him that an unauthorized helicopter was attempting to land on the hotel's roof, strictly prohibited during high-profile events for security reasons. Alexander frowned, irritated by the disruption of his perfectly orchestrated day. He instructed them to handle it discreetly. Whatever attention-seeking stunt someone was pulling, he wouldn't allow it to overshadow this crucial performance. But the commotion only grew. The ballroom doors burst open again, this time revealing hotel security rushing in, confusion evident on their faces. They were followed by a woman Alexander didn't immediately recognize. Her chin-length dark hair styled elegantly, her navy blue dress simple but clearly expensive, her posture radiating a confidence that silenced the room. Then she lifted her gaze, and Alexander felt the floor drop away beneath him. Those eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber. Eyes he had dreamed about for 3 years while telling himself he felt nothing. Elena. But this wasn't the Elena who had left his penthouse that rainy night. This woman moved with the assurance of someone who belonged in any room she entered. Diamond earrings caught the light as she stepped forward. At her side walked a small boy, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, his hand trustingly in hers. Alexander's gaze locked on the child. Something in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, sending a jolt of recognition through him, before his conscious mind could process why. The wedding guests had fallen into stunned silence. Sofia stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, her perfect moment shattered. Philip moved protectively toward his sister. while Victoria Ashford, seated in the front row, went visibly pale. Elena walked calmly to the center of the room, the little boy keeping pace beside her. In her free hand, she carried a sleek leather portfolio. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than Alexander remembered, but with the same quiet dignity that had once captivated him. She apologized for interrupting such an important occasion, but explained that she had information Mr. Reed needed to see immediately. Information that couldn't wait, even for his wedding day. Her tone held no anger, no bitterness, just steady resolve. The boy beside her looked around with curious eyes. Familiar eyes that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. Security started forward again, but Alexander raised a hand, stopping them. Something in Elena's expression told him this wasn't a simple act of revenge or disruption. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she carried in that portfolio, it was something he needed to hear. Even now, even after everything, he found himself trusting her certainty. Alexander requested a private room to hear what Elena had to say. Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd as he stepped down from the altar, as the carefully planned ceremony derailed before their eyes. Sophia's face hardened into a mask of humiliation and fury. Philip looked thunderous, already calculating the damage control this public spectacle would require. A side room was quickly arranged, a small salon adjacent to the ballroom where Alexander found himself facing Elena across a delicate antique table. The boy sat quietly in a chair by the window, watching them both with solemn eyes. Up close, the resemblance was unmistakable. The child had Alexander's eyes, his grandfather's pronounced chin. The realization hit Alexander like a physical blow. This boy, this child he had never known existed, was his son. Elena didn't waste time on pleasantries or accusations. She opened the portfolio and began presenting evidence with the precision of a prosecutor. First, photographs of Victoria Ashford entering Alexander's private rooms when he wasn't home, removing items from his dresser, his desk. Security camera footage from the building showing her wearing the missing watch as she left one evening, slipping the platinum cufflinks into her purse another day. Next came printouts of emails between Victoria and Philip Harrington, discussing their plan to separate Alexander from the maid he was becoming too attached to. Victoria worried about losing her influence over him. Philip concerned about his sister's prospects if Alexander became entangled with someone so far beneath his station. They had orchestrated the thefts, planted the suspicious notebook where Alexander would find it, manipulated his insecurities and pride to make him believe the worst of the one person who had seen him clearly. Alexander's mind reeled as the evidence mounted. Elena continued without emotion, presenting bank statements showing large transfers from Reed Enterprises to offshore accounts controlled by Philip, siphoning funds through falsified vendor contracts, exploiting Alexander's trust in his oldest friend to embezzle millions. There were records of digital manipulation, corporate emails altered to change key details of contracts, security footage from company headquarters edited to remove incriminating moments. The portfolio contained evidence of crimes that went far beyond personal betrayal. Philip had been systematically undermining Reed Enterprises while positioning himself and Victoria to take control if Alexander ever lost the board's confidence. The Japanese merger, Philip's proposed solution, contained hidden clauses that would have gradually shifted power to a shell company he secretly controlled. Alexander listened in stunned silence as 3 years of perfect certainty crumbled around him. Every decision he had made, every person he had trusted, suddenly cast in a different light. Elena had not been the threat to his empire. She had been the only one who hadn't wanted anything from him beyond genuine connection. Finally, when the evidence had been laid out in irrefutable detail, Alexander found his voice. He asked the question that overshadowed even the shocking betrayals. The boy by the window, watching them with intelligent eyes. His son. Elena's expression softened for the first time since entering the ballroom. Yes, she confirmed. Benjamin was Alexander's child, conceived during those brief weeks of connection before everything fell apart. She had discovered her pregnancy just days before being dismissed, had tried to tell Alexander that final day when he refused to listen. Alexander's gaze returned to the boy, to Benjamin, taking in every detail. The child's serious expression, the careful way he sat without fidgeting, the intelligence evident in his observant silence. A sudden fierce love washed through Alexander, overwhelming in its intensity. A son. His son. The child he had never known he wanted until this moment. But Elena hadn't finished. There was more she needed to share. Something beyond corporate espionage and personal betrayal. Something about Benjamin. She called the boy to her side, running a gentle hand over his dark hair. Benjamin needed specialized medical treatment, she explained. Treatment that was extremely expensive and experimental. That was partly why she had spent the past 3 years gathering evidence against Philip and Victoria. The settlement from exposing their crimes would help fund the medical care their son required. Alexander struggled to absorb this new information. What condition? What treatment? Elena explained carefully, her voice softening as she described the rare blood disorder Benjamin had inherited. Ironically, not from her side, but from the Reed family genetics. A condition that had been carefully hidden from public knowledge, managed through private doctors and discreet treatments for generations. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. The mysterious treatments his father had undergone throughout his childhood. The unexplained absences. The private medical wing in their family home that no staff were permitted to enter. He had never questioned it. Had been trained from birth not to ask about family secrets. Now those secrets had emerged in his own son, a genetic legacy he hadn't known he carried. Elena had discovered the truth through Benjamin's symptoms and her own relentless research. The condition was manageable with the right care, but that care was specialized and costly. She had been working multiple jobs, saving every penny, but the experimental treatment Benjamin needed remained out of reach. Coming back to Alexander was a last resort, driven not by revenge but by maternal determination to secure her son's future. Alexander stared at the child, at his son, overwhelmed by emotions he had never allowed himself to feel. Guilt for the 3 years lost. Awe at the perfect small person before him. Rage at Philip and Victoria for their betrayal. Confusion about his own role in what had happened. And beneath it all, a surprising, powerful certainty. He would do anything to protect this child, this piece of himself he hadn't known existed until today. Outside, in the ballroom, 600 wedding guests waited. Sophia and her family would be managing the crisis, already crafting the story that would minimize their embarrassment. His carefully constructed world was collapsing, years of certainty giving way to uncomfortable truths. But here, in this quiet room with Elena and Benjamin, Alexander felt more clarity than he had in 3 years. He knelt before his son, coming to eye level with the serious little boy who studied him with such careful attention. Benjamin didn't shy away, didn't show fear of this stranger who was his father. Instead, he reached out one small hand and touched Alexander's cheek, a gesture of such simple trust that it broke something open inside the man who had spent a lifetime guarding himself against genuine emotion. That touch, more than all the evidence in Elena's portfolio, more than the genetic bond they shared, cemented Alexander's next decision. He would not return to that ballroom, would not continue with a loveless marriage built on calculation and convenience, would not pretend that the empire mattered more than the truth Elena had risked everything to bring him. Alexander asked for Benjamin's full name. Elena Vasquez Reed, she answered. She had given him his father's name, even believing that father would never know him. It was important to her that Benjamin understand where he came from, the legacy of strength that was his birthright along with the medical condition that challenged him. For the first time since she had entered the Plaza Hotel, Elena's composure faltered. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted how many times she had almost contacted Alexander during her pregnancy, during Benjamin's first days, during the frightening nights when his symptoms first appeared. Pride and hurt had held her back, along with the certainty that Alexander had chosen his world of wealth and power over anything they might have shared. It was only when Benjamin's condition worsened, when specialists confirmed he had inherited the rare Reed family disorder, that Elena had begun investigating more deeply. The medical research had led her to financial discrepancies, which led to digital evidence of tampering. One discovery built upon another, until she had assembled the full picture of betrayal that had shaped all their lives. Alexander processed this information with growing clarity. Everything that had happened, every choice, every consequence, had led to this moment, to this room, this revelation, this child, to the opportunity to make different choices going forward. He asked Elena what she wanted now. Money for Benjamin's treatment? Public vindication? Revenge against those who had separated them? Her answer surprised him in its simplicity. She wanted nothing for herself, she said. Only what Benjamin needed: medical care, security, and if Alexander was willing, a relationship with his father. She had not come to destroy Alexander's wedding out of spite, but because the evidence she had gathered indicated that Philip planned to finalize his takeover of Reed Enterprises immediately following the marriage to his sister. There had been no time left to wait. A knock at the door interrupted them. The hotel manager, clearly uncomfortable, informed Alexander that the situation in the ballroom was becoming untenable. Guests were getting restless. Sophia and her family were demanding answers. The press had somehow gotten wind of the disruption, and reporters were gathering outside. Alexander made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. He instructed the manager to announce to the guests that the wedding was canceled. There would be no further explanation today. Transportation would be arranged for anyone who needed it. The Harrington family should be informed that he would address them privately, but not now. Not until he had time to process everything he had learned. The manager's eyes widened, but he nodded and withdrew. Alexander turned back to Elena and Benjamin, suddenly aware that he had no plan beyond this moment. His carefully ordered life had been upended, years of certainty replaced by questions he had no answers for. All he knew was that he wouldn't return to the path he had been following, couldn't pretend that the empire was worth the cost it had demanded of him. Elena seemed to understand his uncertainty. She had never expected this day to unfold as it had. Her plan had been to present the evidence, ensure Benjamin's medical needs would be met, and depart. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for more. Had protected her heart against further disappointment. Alexander looked at his son again, marveling at this small person who somehow combined the best of both his parents. Benjamin's serious expression, his watchful intelligence, the quiet dignity that reminded Alexander so much of Elena. And beneath those qualities, something uniquely his own, a resilience in the face of challenges that humbled his father. In that moment, Alexander Reed, heir to billions, corporate titan, man who had spent his life avoiding true connection, made the first completely unstrategic decision of his adult life. He asked Elena if he could hold his son, not as a legal right or a Reed heir, but as the gift he had never known to want. Elena hesitated only a moment before nodding, gently encouraging Benjamin toward his father. The boy went willingly, curiosity overcoming shyness. Alexander lifted him carefully, feeling the solid weight of this small life in his arms. Benjamin studied his father's face with solemn intensity, then reached up to touch Alexander's cheek again, a gesture that felt like absolution for 3 years of absence. Alexander's throat tightened with emotion he had never allowed himself to feel. Outside the salon, the consequences of his choice were unfolding. 600 guests discovering that the society wedding of the year had been derailed by the arrival of a former maid and a small boy. Sophia and her family facing humiliation and rage. Philip and Victoria realizing their careful plans had been exposed. The board members who had attended the wedding already calculating what this meant for Reed Enterprises. The press crafting headlines that would dominate tomorrow's news. But here, in this quiet room with Elena and their son, Alexander found himself caring less about those consequences than he would have thought possible. For the first time in his life, the weight of the Reed name, the expectations of the empire, the opinions of society, all of it seemed less important than the truth he had denied for too long. The truth that love, not power, was what gave life meaning. Elena watched them together, her own emotions carefully contained. She had not come seeking reconciliation or romance, had not allowed herself to hope that Alexander would choose them over the world he belonged to. She had simply done what was necessary for their son, faced the man who had once cast her out, presented the truth without flinching. But seeing Alexander with Benjamin now, witnessing the instant connection between father and son, she felt something long buried flickering back to life. Not forgiveness, not yet. Not trust, too much had happened. But possibility. The chance that from the wreckage of betrayal and misunderstanding, something true might yet emerge. Alexander looked up from his son to meet Elena's gaze. The world was waiting outside that door, demanding explanations, requiring decisions. His empire, his reputation, his carefully constructed life, all of it hanging in the balance. But for now, in this moment, he was simply a man discovering that he was a father. Everything else would have to wait. As if understanding the weight of the moment, Benjamin reached up to touch the furrow between Alexander's brows, a gesture Elena recognized as one she often made when her son was worried. The simple touch broke the tension, drawing a genuine smile from Alexander, perhaps the first real one in 3 years. Whatever came next would not be easy. There were legal battles ahead, corporate wars to fight, a lifetime of secrets and lies to unravel. Benjamin's medical condition required immediate attention, specialists to consult, treatments to arrange. Alexander and Elena had 3 years of absence to navigate, trust to rebuild if that was even possible. The Reed Empire stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain now that its heir had chosen a different path. But as Benjamin settled comfortably in his father's arms, as Elena allowed herself to truly see the man she had once loved beneath the corporate mask he had worn for so long, a fragile hope began to take root, not for an easy reconciliation or a fairy tale ending, but for something more valuable, the chance to build something true from the ruins of what had been lost. Alexander held his son close, memorizing the weight of him, the scent of his hair, the small hand that still rested trustingly against his cheek. In his mind, the voices of expectation, his father's, the board's, society's, grew quieter for the first time in his life, replaced by something simpler and infinitely more powerful, the voice of his own heart, rediscovered after years of silence. Whatever came next, he would face it not as the Reed heir, not as the corporate titan, but as Benjamin's father, as the man Elena had once seen beneath the wealth and power, as the person he might have been all along, if he had been brave enough to choose differently. Now finally, he was ready to make that choice. The aftermath of Alexander's canceled wedding exploded across New York society like a sudden summer storm. By evening, every major news outlet had picked up the story. The billionaire heir, the abandoned bride, the former maid who had arrived by helicopter with a child no one knew existed. Speculation ran wild, facts twisted and embellished with each retelling. The Reed name, always associated with power and dignity, was now entangled with scandal and intrigue. Alexander didn't see the headlines. After leaving the plaza, he had taken Elena and Benjamin to a private Reed property on the outskirts of the city, a modernist glass house nestled in woodlands that had once been his personal retreat from corporate life. Few people knew of its existence. His father had purchased it through a holding company decades ago. It was the one place Alexander could think of where they might have space to breathe, to process what had happened, to begin figuring out what came next. Benjamin fell asleep shortly after their arrival, the day's excitement finally catching up with him. Elena tucked him into the guest bedroom, her movements so practiced and tender that Alexander felt a fresh wave of loss for all the moments he had missed. First steps, first words, bedtime rituals he should have shared. He watched from the doorway as she smoothed their son's dark hair, whispering something too soft for him to hear. The intimacy of the scene struck him with unexpected force. This was his family. These two people who had existed without him, building their own world of love and trust while he had been constructing empty monuments to the Reed legacy. Once Benjamin was settled, Alexander and Elena sat in strained silence in the living room, the events of the day settling between them like sediment in still water. Where did they even begin to address what had happened? How did they move forward from a past so tangled with misunderstanding and betrayal? Elena spoke first, her voice measured but direct. She hadn't intended to destroy his wedding, she said. The timing had been forced by urgent developments. Benjamin's latest test results had shown his condition worsening faster than expected. Meanwhile, her investigation had uncovered Philip's final moves to seize control of Reed Enterprises, transactions set to execute immediately following Alexander's marriage to Sophia. Legal documents already drafted to push Alexander out of his own company on grounds of negligence and mismanagement. Evidence manufactured to suggest he was mentally unstable. The wedding day had been her last chance to prevent complete disaster for them all. Alexander listened, his mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. He had gone from groom to father, to potential corporate victim in the space of hours. The people he had trusted most had been systematically betraying him for years. The woman he had cast out in anger had been protecting him all along. His son, had been living with a dangerous medical condition without his knowledge or support. Elena withdrew a folder from her bag. Medical records, specialist reports, treatment protocols. Benjamin had been diagnosed at 18 months with Reed thrombocythemia, the rare blood disorder that had been the Reed family's carefully guarded secret for generations. Alexander's father had had it. His grandfather, too. The condition caused abnormal blood clotting, increasing risks of stroke and organ damage if not carefully managed. Treatment existed, but was complex and ongoing. The experimental therapy Benjamin needed was only available through a research program in Switzerland, with limited slots and costs running into millions. Alexander examined the reports, recognizing some of the terminology from his father's private medical documents. The Reed family had hidden the condition for generations, fearing it would undermine confidence in their leadership, suggest weakness in their bloodline. Private doctors, discreet treatments, a veil of secrecy maintained through power and money. His father had undergone regular treatments throughout Alexander's childhood, disappearing into the private medical wing without explanation. Alexander had been tested at birth, found not to manifest symptoms, though he obviously carried the gene to have passed it to his son. Elena had discovered the family history through relentless research after Benjamin's symptoms appeared. She had contacted specialists anonymously, connecting the dots between Benjamin's condition and the carefully obscured medical history of the Reed dynasty. Alexander marveled at her determination, her intelligence in uncovering what generations had worked to hide. She had done everything possible for their son while he had been planning a loveless marriage and expanding an empire built on secrets. As the night deepened around the glass house, Elena and Alexander began the difficult process of reconstructing the events that had separated them. Victoria Ashford's jealousy when she noticed Alexander's growing attachment to Elena. Philip Harrington's concern that his carefully laid plans for his sister and his own financial schemes might be derailed. Their decision to remove Elena from the equation by planting evidence of theft, knowing Alexander's pride and family history would make him quick to believe the worst. What neither Victoria nor Philip had known was Elena's pregnancy. She had discovered it just days before her dismissal, had been gathering courage to tell Alexander when the accusations shattered everything. Cast out with nowhere to go, no references, and a child on the way, Elena had returned to her sister in Houston. There she had given birth to Benjamin, worked multiple jobs to support them both, and begun noticing the first worrying symptoms in her son when he was barely a year old. The diagnosis had been devastating, a condition she had never heard of, treatments her modest income couldn't begin to cover. She had exhausted her savings on specialists, medical tests, consultations. When Benjamin's condition worsened, Elena had faced the hardest decision of her life: to contact the man who had rejected her, to ask for help from someone who had shown how little he valued her truth. Instead, her research into the Reed family medical history had led her to something unexpected: discrepancies in company accounts, digital trails of manipulated documents, evidence of systematic betrayal by Alexander's closest advisors. The more she uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Alexander hadn't just been wrong about her. He had been deliberately misled by those he trusted most. Gathering evidence had become Elena's mission, not just for Benjamin's sake, but for Alexander's too. She had worked remotely for a cybersecurity firm, developing skills that let her follow digital breadcrumbs. She had made connections with former Reed employees who had their own stories of Philip's manipulations. Piece by piece, she had assembled the portfolio of evidence that she finally presented on what should have been Alexander's wedding day. As they talked through the tangled past, the glass walls of the house reflected their images back at them. Two people irrevocably connected by the child sleeping upstairs, by choices made and unmade, by truths finally emerging from years of lies. Alexander felt emotions he had spent a lifetime suppressing: rage at Philip's betrayal, grief for the years lost with his son, shame for how easily he had been manipulated into discarding the one person who had seen him clearly. Elena's feelings were more complex: relief at finally sharing the burden she had carried alone, lingering hurt from Alexander's lack of faith in her, fierce protectiveness toward Benjamin, and uncertainty about what Alexander truly wanted from them now. She had not come seeking romantic reconciliation, she emphasized. She had come for their son's sake, for justice, for truth. Whatever happened next needed to prioritize Benjamin's well-being above all else. As dawn broke over the wooded property, they reached the first tentative agreement. Alexander would arrange immediate consultations with the best specialists for Benjamin. He would use his resources to secure a place in the Swiss treatment program. He would begin the process of legally recognizing Benjamin as his son, with all the protection and provision that entailed. And he would use Elena's evidence to confront Philip and Victoria, to reclaim control of his company before their schemes could do any more damage. What remained unspoken between them was the deeper question: what kind of relationship did they want with each other, beyond their shared concern for their son? The connection that had once drawn them together still flickered beneath the surface of their careful interactions. But 3 years of separation and pain couldn't be erased in a single night of truths. Trust, once broken, required more than explanation to rebuild. In the morning, Benjamin woke with the unself-conscious energy of a child, exploring the glass house with curious delight, asking Elena questions about everything he saw. When he spotted Alexander watching from the doorway, he studied him with those serious eyes, so like his father's, before asking simply if Alexander was staying with them now. The straightforward question from this small person hit Alexander with unexpected force. What was he to this child? What did he want to be? Alexander knelt to Benjamin's level, choosing his words carefully. He explained that he was Benjamin's father, that he hadn't known about him before but was very happy to know him now, that he wanted to help Benjamin get better, to be part of his life if Benjamin wanted that too. The boy considered this with surprising thoughtfulness for his age, then nodded as if accepting the terms of an agreement. He asked if Alexander knew how to make pancakes. Somehow, that simple question felt like the most important one Alexander had ever been asked. He admitted he didn't, but would like to learn. Benjamin took his hand, leading him toward the kitchen with Elena following, a small smile softening her careful expression. That domestic moment, father and son making breakfast together with more enthusiasm than skill, Elena correcting their technique with patient amusement, felt surreal after the high drama of the previous day. For a brief time, they existed in a bubble separate from the crisis unfolding in the world beyond the glass walls. No press, no corporate intrigue, no medical concerns. Just a family finding its tentative footing. Reality intruded shortly after breakfast. Alexander's phone, which he had silenced upon arriving at the house, showed dozens of missed calls and messages. Philip, Sophia, board members, his lawyers, the press, the world demanding explanations, decisions, action. Most urgent were the messages from his chief financial officer, reporting unusual activity in company accounts. Large transfers being processed, access credentials suddenly changed, digital records being modified or deleted. Philip was accelerating his plans, using the wedding disruption as cover for his final move against Reed Enterprises. Alexander knew he couldn't delay facing what waited beyond their temporary sanctuary. He needed to address the corporate crisis immediately, to use Elena's evidence before Philip could complete his takeover or destroy more records. But the thought of leaving Benjamin and Elena, of re-entering that world of power, plays, and betrayal, filled him with unexpected reluctance. For the first time in his life, the empire felt like a burden rather than a birthright. Elena sensed his conflict. She reminded him that she hadn't gathered all that evidence just to watch Philip succeed in the end. Alexander needed to fight for his company, not just for himself but for Benjamin too. That empire, built by generations of Reeds, was part of their son's heritage. Alexander shouldn't let Philip steal it away because of misplaced priorities. There would be time for them to figure out their family situation after the immediate crisis was resolved. Her practical strength steadied him. This was what had first drawn him to Elena. Her clarity, her unflinching honesty, her ability to see what needed to be done without being blinded by emotion or convention. Even now, after everything that had happened between them, she was helping him find his way forward. Alexander called his most trusted remaining executives, those not in Philip's pocket, and his personal attorney, arranging an emergency meeting at the glass house, rather than company headquarters where Philip might have eyes and ears. He didn't want to leave Benjamin and Elena, not while the press was hunting for them, and not when his son might need him at any moment. The corporate world would have to come to him for once. As Alexander prepared for the meeting, Elena took Benjamin outside to explore the wooded grounds. The boy's energy seemed boundless this morning, no outward sign of the condition threatening his future. Watching them from the window, Alexander was struck by a clarity he had never experienced in boardrooms or business negotiations. Whatever happened with the company, whatever legal and financial battles lay ahead, nothing was more important than ensuring this child had a future. Everything else, the Reed legacy, the corporate empire, his own pride, paled in comparison to that single truth. By afternoon, Alexander's crisis team had assembled in the glass house living room. Elena had taken Benjamin to rest in the back bedroom, his morning energy giving way to the fatigue that was one symptom of his condition. Now Alexander presented Elena's evidence to his stunned executives and legal team. The systematic embezzlement, the digital manipulation of records, the planned corporate coup timed to coincide with his honeymoon absence. Philip's elaborate betrayal laid bare in meticulous detail. His chief legal counsel was particularly shaken. She had worked alongside Philip for years, trusted him as Alexander had. The evidence was irrefutable, she confirmed. Enough for criminal charges, enough to remove Philip from the board immediately, enough to freeze the company accounts he was currently draining. But they needed to move fast. Every hour that passed gave Philip more opportunity to cover his tracks or transfer assets beyond their reach. Alexander authorized immediate legal action, emergency court orders to freeze accounts, digital forensics teams to secure evidence, security protocols to lock Philip out of all company systems. His team mobilized with practiced efficiency, making calls, sending documents, setting the machinery of corporate warfare in motion. For hours, the peaceful retreat became a command center. Alexander moving between urgent business matters and checking on Benjamin, his worlds colliding in ways he could never have imagined. By evening, the first counterattacks had been launched. Philip's access to Reed Enterprises was severed. The questionable financial transfers had been halted. The board had been informed of the evidence against him. An emergency meeting scheduled for the following morning. The legal team was preparing both criminal charges and civil suits to recover the embezzled funds. In the midst of this corporate battle, Benjamin's condition took a sudden turn. Elena called Alexander from the bedroom, her voice tight with controlled fear. Their son was running a high fever, his breathing labored, his small body flushed and restless. Alexander dismissed his team immediately, all thoughts of business forgotten as he joined Elena at Benjamin's bedside. The symptoms were consistent with a crisis event related to his condition, Elena explained as she efficiently gathered their things. Benjamin needed medical attention immediately, not just any emergency room, but specialists who understood his rare disorder. Alexander called his helicopter to the property, while Elena prepared Benjamin for transport, her movements quick but gentle, murmuring reassurances to their half-conscious son. For Alexander, nothing had ever been as terrifying as that helicopter ride to New York Presbyterian Hospital, where he had arranged for specialists to meet them. Benjamin seemed so small and fragile in Elena's arms, his normally alert eyes glazed with fever, his breathing shallow. Elena maintained remarkable composure, monitoring his pulse, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, sharing medical history with the pilot to relay ahead to the hospital. But Alexander saw the fear she was containing, recognized in her careful control the same terror that was coursing through him. In that suspended moment between sky and earth, between the corporate war he had just initiated and the medical battle they were rushing toward, Alexander experienced a clarifying truth. Nothing, not his company, not his fortune, not his pride or reputation, mattered compared to the life of this child he had only just discovered. If saving Benjamin meant walking away from everything else, he would do it without hesitation. The hospital team was waiting when they landed on the helipad. Doctors, nurses, specialists Alexander had summoned with the full force of the Reed name and resources. Benjamin was whisked away immediately, Elena following close behind, reciting medical history and recent symptoms with precise detail. Alexander followed, feeling suddenly superfluous, acutely aware that Elena had handled countless medical crises without him, had become expert in their son's condition through necessity and love. For hours they waited as Benjamin underwent tests and treatments. Elena barely spoke, her energy focused entirely on their son, answering medical questions, reviewing test results, discussing treatment options with the specialists. Alexander remained at her side, offering whatever support he could, arranging private rooms, ensuring the best doctors remained available, making calls to specialists in Switzerland about the experimental treatment program. Practical things that couldn't express the depth of his fear, his desperate need to protect this child he had only just found. Near midnight, the crisis temporarily stabilized. Benjamin was admitted to a private room, his condition serious but no longer immediately life-threatening. Medications were controlling his symptoms, while further treatment plans were developed. The relief was palpable, but tentative. This episode had been more severe than previous ones, the doctors explained. It underscored the urgent need for the specialized treatment available only through the Swiss research program. As Benjamin finally slept, monitors beeping softly beside his bed, Elena stepped into the hallway for a moment of privacy. Alexander followed, finding her leaning against the wall, eyes closed, the careful composure finally cracking to reveal the exhaustion and fear beneath. Without thinking, he wrapped his arms around her. She stiffened initially, then gradually softened against him, accepting the comfort neither of them could put into words. They stood like that for long moments, connected by shared terror for their child, by the strange intimacy that only parents can know in such moments. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was muffled against his shoulder. She had been so scared. Every episode was worse than the last. The doctors in Houston had warned her that without the specialized treatment, Benjamin's prognosis was uncertain. She had been racing against time, gathering evidence, finding Alexander, fighting for their son's future on every possible front. Alexander tightened his arms around her, overwhelmed by her strength, her relentless determination to protect their child. He had spent 3 years building corporate empires, making millions, expanding his power and influence. She had spent those same years in the trenches of a more vital battle, working multiple jobs, researching treatments, nurturing their son through each medical crisis. The contrast humbled him beyond words. When they returned to Benjamin's bedside, a new understanding existed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation, but a truce born of shared purpose. Whatever their past, whatever might or might not develop between them as adults, they were united completely in their commitment to Benjamin's well-being. That clarity would guide every decision moving forward. Morning brought both medical news and corporate developments. Benjamin's condition had stabilized further, though he remained weak and would need to stay hospitalized for several days. The specialists confirmed what Elena had already discovered. The experimental treatment in Switzerland represented Benjamin's best hope for long-term management of his condition. Alexander immediately set his team working on securing a place in the program, using every connection and resource at his disposal. On the corporate front, the emergency board meeting was underway, with Alexander participating remotely from the hospital. The evidence against Philip was being presented, his removal from the company proceeding as planned. But even as that crisis was being addressed, Alexander found his priorities shifting in fundamental ways. He instructed his team to focus on stabilizing the company and recovering embezzled funds, but made it clear that his personal attention would remain with his son. For perhaps the first time in Reed Enterprises' history, the company would need to function temporarily without its leader's constant presence. As the day progressed, Alexander moved between corporate crisis management and Benjamin's bedside, between conference calls and medical consultations. Elena remained focused exclusively on their son, her attention only occasionally diverted by updates on the company situation or treatment program possibilities. She had lived for 3 years with Benjamin as her sole priority. She wasn't about to change that now that Alexander had entered the picture. By evening, progress had been made on multiple fronts. Benjamin's treatment was showing positive results, his fever reduced, his breathing easier. The specialists were cautiously optimistic about his immediate recovery, though emphatic about the need for the experimental treatment to prevent future episodes. Alexander's team had made initial contact with the Swiss program directors, the Reed name opening doors that might have remained closed to Elena alone. On the corporate side, Philip Harrington had been officially removed from all positions at Reed Enterprises. His access to company assets had been completely severed, criminal investigations initiated, civil recovery proceedings begun. Victoria Ashford had been terminated as well, her role in the conspiracy fully documented in Elena's evidence. The legal battles were just beginning, but the immediate threat to the company had been neutralized. The Harrington family, including the abandoned bride, Sophia, had released a statement denouncing Philip's actions and expressing shock at the revelations. Whether they had truly been unaware of his schemes remained unclear, but they were strategically distancing themselves from the growing scandal. The press was having a field day with the story. The jilted billionaire groom, the corporate espionage, the secret heir appearing at the last moment. Reality was becoming entangled with speculation and sensationalism with each news cycle. Alexander paid little attention to the media frenzy. His focus remained divided between Benjamin's treatment and securing the company against further damage from Philip's schemes. But as Benjamin's condition continued to improve, as the immediate corporate crisis stabilized, Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to the question that had been pushed aside by more urgent concerns. What happened next for the three of them? Elena had created a life without him, had proven herself more than capable of raising their son alone, of fighting battles on multiple fronts without his support. She had made it clear from the beginning that she hadn't come seeking romantic reconciliation. Yet the connection between them remained, complicated now by shared concern for Benjamin, by the intimate partnership of parents facing a child's illness together. For Alexander, the past days had transformed everything. His perception of success, his priorities, his understanding of what truly mattered. The empire that had once defined him now seemed hollow, compared to the relationships he was just beginning to build with his son and perhaps with Elena. But he had no right to expect her forgiveness, no claim on her heart after what had happened between them. Whatever his growing feelings, the choice would be hers. Late that night, with Benjamin sleeping peacefully under the watchful eyes of private nurses, Alexander and Elena stepped outside the hospital room to speak privately. They had been operating in emergency mode since the wedding day, moving from one crisis to the next with barely a moment to address what existed between them. Now, in the quiet hospital corridor, the unresolved questions could no longer be avoided. Elena spoke first, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She needed to be clear about her expectations, about boundaries going forward. Benjamin's health was her priority, securing the treatment he needed, establishing a stable environment for his recovery. She welcomed Alexander's involvement in their son's life, his support for Benjamin's medical care, but she wasn't ready to consider anything beyond co-parenting. Too much had happened. Too much trust had been broken. She needed time, space to determine what, if anything, might be rebuilt between them. Alexander listened without interrupting, respect for her position outweighing his own growing desire for a second chance. She was right to protect herself, to prioritize Benjamin's needs above emotional complications. Her boundaries were reasonable, fair given their history. He assured her that he accepted her terms without reservation. Benjamin would come first. Everything else could wait until they were both ready to address it, if that day ever came. As they stood in that sterile hospital corridor, the future stretching uncertainly before them, Alexander realized something profound. 3 years ago, in his penthouse, he had held all the power in their relationship, employer to employee, wealthy patron to dependent staff. Now, despite his billions, despite the empire he controlled, the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Elena was his equal in every way that mattered. In strength, in intelligence, in love for their son. Perhaps she always had been, and he had simply been too blinded by privilege to see it. That night, as Alexander arranged for a cot to be brought into Benjamin's room so he could remain close to his son, he found himself contemplating a future very different from the one he had imagined just days earlier. Not a corporate titan ruling alone from his glass tower, but a father learning to place love above pride, connection above control, family above empire. The path forward was uncertain, filled with medical concerns for Benjamin, legal battles against Philip, complicated emotions between himself and Elena. But for the first time in Alexander's carefully planned life, uncertainty felt strangely like freedom, the chance to build something authentic from the ruins of what had been destroyed. As he drifted towards sleep, lulled by the soft beeping of Benjamin's monitors and the gentle sound of Elena's breathing from the chair beside their son's bed, Alexander found himself hoping. Not for forgiveness he hadn't yet earned, not for reconciliation that might never come, but simply for the chance to prove, day by day, that he could become the father Benjamin deserved, and perhaps, eventually, the man worthy of Elena's trust once more. Days at the hospital blurred together as Benjamin slowly recovered from the crisis. Alexander surprised himself with how easily he adapted to the rhythms of their son's care, monitoring medication schedules, discussing treatment options with specialists, even learning to coax Benjamin into eating when his appetite waned. Elena watched this transformation with cautious hope, noting how naturally Alexander had stepped into the role of father, despite his lack of experience. The Swiss medical team had reviewed Benjamin's case remotely and confirmed what they had feared. His condition was progressing more rapidly than typical cases. Without the experimental treatment program, future episodes would likely increase in severity and frequency. The specialists had agreed to accept Benjamin into the program, expediting his case based on the latest test results. Treatment could begin as soon as he was stable enough to travel. Meanwhile, the corporate situation continued to unfold. Philip Harrington had disappeared briefly after his removal from Reed Enterprises, but federal authorities had located him attempting to board a private plane to a non-extradition country. He was now in custody, facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, corporate espionage, and various financial crimes. Victoria Ashford had turned state's evidence, offering testimony against Philip in exchange for leniency, revealing even more extensive corruption than Elena's evidence had uncovered. The Reed Enterprises board had rallied behind Alexander after the initial shock, impressed by his decisive handling of the crisis despite personal turmoil. His legal team had already recovered significant portions of the embezzled funds, and the company's stock, after an initial plunge, had stabilized as investor confidence returned. Alexander managed most of this remotely from the hospital, conducting video conferences from an empty patient room, reviewing documents between Benjamin's treatments, making decisions that once would have consumed his full attention, but now felt secondary to his son's progress. On the 7th day after Benjamin's admission, his doctors confirmed he was stable enough for the journey to Switzerland. The experimental treatment couldn't wait any longer. Alexander had already arranged everything. His private jet reconfigured with medical equipment, specialists to accompany them, accommodations near the research facility. All that remained was for Elena to agree to the plan. Elena had been understandably hesitant about leaving the country with Benjamin, about placing so much trust in Alexander after everything that had happened. But Benjamin's condition left no room for half measures or delayed decisions. The treatment in Switzerland represented his best hope, perhaps his only hope, for a normal life. After reviewing all the arrangements, consulting independently with the Swiss medical team, and seeing Alexander's unwavering commitment to their son's care, Elena gave her consent. 2 days later, they boarded Alexander's modified jet, Benjamin excited despite his weakened condition, fascinated by the airplane and the adventure ahead. Elena remained outwardly calm, but Alexander noticed how tightly she held Benjamin's hand during takeoff, how carefully she monitored every aspect of his comfort during the flight. Alexander had arranged for a private medical team to accompany them, but Elena still personally checked each medication, each vital sign, trusting no one else completely with their son's well-being. The flight gave Alexander and Elena time together that wasn't filled with immediate crises or medical emergencies. As Benjamin napped, monitored by the flight nurse, they found themselves talking more openly than they had since reuniting. Alexander spoke about his regrets, not just for doubting her loyalty 3 years ago, but for the person he had been before meeting her. The corporate automaton, so focused on the Reed legacy that he had never questioned whether the empire was worth what it cost him in humanity. Elena shared more about her life after leaving his penthouse, the fear and uncertainty of pregnancy without support, the joy of Benjamin's birth despite the circumstances, the terror when his symptoms first appeared. She had never stopped loving their son's father, she admitted quietly, but had learned to bury that love beneath the more urgent demands of survival and Benjamin's care. She wasn't sure what remained of those feelings now, what could possibly be rebuilt from so much pain and separation. Alexander didn't push for more than she was ready to give. The trust between them was still fragile, focused primarily on their shared commitment to Benjamin. Whatever might develop beyond that would need time, patience, consistent proof that he had truly changed. For now, it was enough that they were united in purpose, moving toward a future where their son might thrive. The Swiss medical facility was nothing like traditional hospitals. A modern complex nestled in the Alps, combining cutting-edge research capabilities with a healing environment. Benjamin's eyes widened as he took in the mountain views from his private suite, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing snow-capped peaks that seemed close enough to touch. Elena relaxed slightly, seeing the quality of the facility, the credentials of the specialists who would oversee their son's treatment. The experimental protocol would take months, an initial intensive phase of specialized treatments, followed by carefully monitored recovery and adjustment periods. The process targeted the genetic factors behind Reed thrombocythemia, using breakthrough techniques that had shown promising results in similar rare blood disorders. The success rate was encouraging, but not guaranteed. Benjamin would be the youngest patient to undergo the complete protocol, adding additional unknowns to an already experimental treatment. Alexander arranged for a chalet near the medical facility, a comfortable home where Benjamin could recover between treatments and where Elena could maintain some semblance of normal life for their son. He secured a local staff, housekeepers, a cook, a driver, but was careful to consult Elena on every decision, respecting that she had been making all such choices for Benjamin alone for 3 years. Alexander might be paying the bills, but Elena remained the authority on their son's needs and routines. As Benjamin's treatment began, Alexander and Elena established a delicate co-parenting balance. Elena continued as Benjamin's primary caregiver, maintaining the bond and routines that had sustained them for years. Alexander found his place more gradually, learning from Elena's example, discovering his son's preferences and fears, building trust through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. Benjamin accepted his father's growing role with the adaptability of childhood, his initial wariness giving way to genuine attachment as Alexander proved himself reliable day after day. The Reed Enterprises crisis continued to demand Alexander's attention, but he managed it differently now. Instead of returning to New York, he established a remote office in the chalet, limiting video conferences to hours when Benjamin was in treatment, reviewing documents after their son was asleep. His executive team had stepped up admirably in his partial absence, many of them finding renewed purpose in rebuilding the company's integrity after Philip's betrayal. Alexander provided direction and made critical decisions, but no longer felt the need to control every aspect of operations. His priorities had fundamentally shifted. Weeks passed, stretching into months. Benjamin's response to the treatment cautiously encouraged his medical team. There were difficult days, side effects that left him exhausted, temporary setbacks that terrified his parents, moments when the experimental nature of the protocol became all too apparent. Through each challenge, Alexander and Elena presented a united front, taking shifts at Benjamin's bedside, supporting each other through the worst fears no parent should have to face. In the quieter periods between treatment phases, they established a family rhythm previously unknown to any of them. Alexander found unexpectedly profound satisfaction in ordinary moments, helping Benjamin with the schoolwork his tutor assigned, reading bedtime stories, building elaborate snow forts outside the chalet during good days. Elena watched this developing bond with complicated emotions, joy for her son's sake, lingering wariness for her own heart, and growing respect for the man Alexander was becoming away from the pressures of his former life. The legal proceedings against Philip continued in New York, occasionally requiring Alexander's remote testimony or decisions. Philip had attempted various legal maneuvers to reduce his exposure, but the evidence Elena had gathered proved insurmountable. Victoria's testimony further sealed his fate. Reed Enterprises had emerged from the crisis stronger, more transparent, its leadership restructured to prevent similar vulnerabilities in the future. Alexander remained chairman and majority shareholder, but had appointed a trusted CEO to handle daily operations, freeing him to focus on his family during this critical period. 6 months into Benjamin's treatment, the medical team confirmed what careful parents had already begun to hope. The protocol was working better than expected. Benjamin's blood values were stabilizing, episodes becoming less frequent and less severe. His energy returned more consistently between treatments, his natural resilience asserting itself as the medical interventions took hold. There would be no miracle cure. Reed thrombocythemia remained a chronic condition requiring lifelong management. But the worst dangers were receding, the prognosis shifting from uncertain to cautiously optimistic. As Benjamin's health improved, the temporary nature of their arrangement in Switzerland became increasingly apparent. Eventually, they would need to decide what came next, where they would live, how they would structure their family life, what relationship would exist between Alexander and Elena beyond their shared concern for their son. These questions that had been deferred during the medical crisis now quietly resurfaced in the spaces between more urgent concerns. Alexander had been thinking about these questions with growing clarity. His life in New York, the penthouse, the corporate battlefield, the society obligations, held little appeal now. He had maintained his business responsibilities out of obligation to employees and shareholders, but the empire itself no longer defined him as it once had. What mattered now was being present for Benjamin's childhood, creating a foundation of security and love that his own privileged upbringing had somehow lacked despite all its material advantages. And then there was Elena, living in close proximity during Benjamin's treatment, sharing the intense emotions of their son's medical journey. Alexander had found his admiration and attraction deepening beyond what he had felt 3 years ago. The young maid who had caught his attention with her quiet dignity had become this formidable woman, resilient, principled, fiercely protective, completely unimpressed by his wealth or status. He wanted a second chance with her, but recognized that the decision was entirely hers. He had forfeited any right to expectations when he had cast her out without listening to her truth. Elena, too, had been re-evaluating her feelings during these months in Switzerland. She observed Alexander's transformation with cautious hope, his genuine devotion to Benjamin, his willingness to restructure his entire life around their son's needs, his respect for her boundaries and decisions. This was not the arrogant heir who had dismissed her without a hearing, whose pride had outweighed his trust. This was a man learning to place love above ego, connection above control, family above empire. A man earning his way back into her heart through consistent action rather than grand declarations. One evening, with Benjamin asleep after a good day of normal childhood activity, Alexander and Elena sat on the chalet's terrace, looking out at the mountains gilded by sunset. The beauty seemed almost unreal after so many months focused on medical facilities and treatment protocols. A reminder that there was a world beyond illness, beyond crisis, a future to consider. Alexander spoke first, tentatively laying out thoughts he had been refining for weeks. Benjamin's prognosis was improving steadily. Soon they would need to think about a more permanent arrangement, about education plans, about where and how they would live beyond this medical interlude. He had ideas but wanted Elena's perspective before making any proposals. This was a decision they should make together, as Benjamin's parents. Elena appreciated his approach, the care he took to position them as equals in this conversation, despite the vast disparity in their financial resources. It reflected how far they had come from employer and employee, from accuser and accused. She had been considering options too, whether to return to the States or perhaps remain in Europe, whether to accept Alexander's financial support for Benjamin while maintaining her independence. how to balance her son's need for both parents with her own need for autonomy after years of self-reliance. As they talked through possibilities, a new vision gradually took shape between them. Not a return to New York with its painful memories and public scrutiny, nor a separation with Benjamin shuttled between two households. Instead, a fresh start somewhere new. Perhaps a home in the Swiss countryside where Benjamin had thrived during treatment, or a property in southern France, where neither of them had existing associations. A place where Alexander could remain connected to his business interests remotely while prioritizing family life, where Elena could perhaps resume her interrupted education, where Benjamin could grow up away from the pressures of the Reed legacy until he was old enough to choose his own relationship with that heritage. The conversation continued past midnight, expanding beyond practical arrangements to more personal terrain. For the first time since reuniting, they spoke directly about the feelings that still existed between them, complicated now by history and caution, but undeniably present. Elena acknowledged how profoundly Alexander had changed, how consistently he had demonstrated his commitment to Benjamin, how respectfully he had honored her boundaries during these months of co-parenting. Alexander expressed his deep regret for the choices that had separated them, his gratitude for her courage in returning despite the pain he had caused, his hope that trust might gradually be rebuilt between them. Neither rushed toward declarations or commitments. The foundation of their connection was still healing, still finding its new shape. But as they finally parted for the night, something had shifted. A door opened to possibilities beyond co-parenting, beyond the careful distance they had maintained through Benjamin's treatment. A recognition that the love that had begun in those quiet conversations in the penthouse years ago had never completely died, had instead transformed through pain and separation into something potentially stronger, more honest, more equal. The next morning brought news from New York. Philip Harrington had been convicted on all counts, his sentencing scheduled for the following month. The legal experts expected a substantial prison term given the extent of his crimes and his lack of cooperation with authorities. Victoria Ashford had received a lighter sentence in exchange for her testimony, though her reputation and career were permanently damaged. The corporate crisis was officially over, the threat to Reed Enterprises neutralized, the stolen funds largely recovered. Alexander received the news with surprising detachment. Once, Philip's downfall would have felt like personal vindication, a corporate victory to be savored. Now it seemed like the closing of a chapter he had already moved beyond. More significant was Benjamin's laughter drifting in from the garden where he was building a snowman with his tutor, evidence of normal childhood resilience reasserting itself after months of medical interventions. More meaningful was the way Elena's hand brushed against his when she brought him coffee, the lingering moment of connection that would have been unthinkable months earlier. As Benjamin's treatment entered its final phase, Alexander and Elena began implementing the plans they had discussed that night on the terrace. Alexander located a suitable property in the French countryside, a renovated chateau with modern amenities, extensive grounds for Benjamin to explore, proximity to excellent schools and medical facilities, sufficient privacy to shelter their family from unwanted attention. Elena visited the property with him, offering practical suggestions about what would work for Benjamin's needs, allowing herself cautious excitement about this new beginning they were creating together. Alexander restructured his business interests, maintaining strategic oversight of Reed Enterprises, while delegating day-to-day operations permanently to his trusted executive team. He established a charitable foundation focused on research into rare genetic disorders, inspired by Benjamin's condition, and funded with a significant portion of his personal fortune. The work could be managed from anywhere, requiring only occasional travel to New York or other financial centers. His priorities had permanently shifted from empire building to more meaningful contributions. Elena began considering her own future beyond Benjamin's care. With their son's health stabilizing and Alexander fully engaged as a co-parent, she could finally revisit the educational aspirations she had set aside years ago. Alexander encouraged her to explore opportunities at nearby universities, offering support without attempting to control her choices. Their relationship was evolving into a true partnership, each respecting the other's independence while building something together. Benjamin thrived as his health improved, adapting to each change with remarkable resilience. His interest in architecture, perhaps inherited from the father he was just getting to know, manifested in elaborate structures built from blocks and later in detailed drawings that showed surprising talent for his age. His medical team continued to monitor his condition, adjusting medications and treatments as needed. But the life-threatening crises receded into memory as the experimental protocol proved increasingly successful. 1 year after the dramatic wedding interruption that had changed everything, Alexander, Elena, and Benjamin moved into their French chateau. The property came alive with Benjamin's energy, with the staff Alexander had carefully selected in consultation with Elena, with the new purpose that animated both parents beyond the medical crisis that had initially reunited them. It wasn't the life any of them had expected, certainly not the dynasty Alexander's father had envisioned for his heir, but it held a genuine contentment that wealth alone had never provided. On a warm summer evening, with Benjamin asleep after an active day exploring the chateau grounds, Alexander found Elena in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath an ancient oak tree. The setting sun painted everything in gold, reminding him of that first morning in his penthouse when he had truly noticed her, when something had shifted in his carefully ordered existence. She looked up as he approached, her smile no longer guarded as it had been in those early months of cautious co-parenting. Alexander sat beside her, comfortable now in the silence between them. So much had changed since that rain-soaked night when he had cast her out without a hearing. The corporate titan had become a devoted father. The proud heir had learned humility through loss and recovery. The employer who had once barely noticed his staff had learned to see people clearly, to value connection above position. And Elena had changed too, her quiet strength tempered but not diminished by hardship, her capacity for forgiveness gradually healing the wounds of betrayal, her independence now a choice rather than a necessity. As darkness settled over the garden, Alexander took Elena's hand, a gesture that had once been unthinkable across the divide between their worlds. The remaining walls between them had fallen gradually over months of shared purpose and mutual respect. The attraction that had first drawn them together had matured into something deeper, a partnership forged through crisis, a love tested by separation and reunited through their child. Alexander asked the question he had been waiting to ask, until he had earned the right through consistent action rather than empty promises. Not a request to return to what they had begun 3 years ago in his penthouse, but an invitation to continue building what they had started here. A family, a partnership, a future together on equal terms. Elena's answer, when it came, held neither hesitation nor doubt. The journey that had begun with a maid noticing details no one else saw, and a millionaire finally seeing the person behind the service had come full circle, not to the unequal beginning, but to a new chapter written together. Benjamin's health continued to improve beyond even the specialist's expectations. The experimental treatment had successfully altered the course of his condition, transforming a potentially life-threatening disorder into a manageable chronic condition. He would always require monitoring, would always carry the Reed genetic legacy, but his future stretched before him unbound by the limitations his medical team had initially feared. With both parents supporting him, with the resources to access the best care anywhere in the world, Benjamin faced his future with the same resilience that had carried him through years of uncertainty. Alexander Reed still controlled one of the world's largest financial empires, still held the wealth and influence that came with the Reed name, but the true measure of his life had fundamentally changed. Success was no longer calculated in acquisitions and market share, in board approvals and financial headlines. It existed in Benjamin's laughter as they built elaborate structures from wooden blocks on the chateau floor, in Elena's hand finding his as they walked the property at sunset, in the family they were creating together, day by day, choice by choice. The Reed legacy would continue, but rewritten in terms Alexander's father might not have recognized or approved. Founded on love rather than ambition, on connection rather than control, on truth rather than appearance. Benjamin would inherit not just wealth and position, but the more valuable lessons his parents had learned through loss and redemption, that empires crumble but family endures, that pride costs more than humility, that seeing others clearly is the rarest and most precious form of wealth. Elena watched this transformation with wonder and gratitude, remembering the lonely maid who had once loved from a distance, who had been cast out in the rain carrying an unknown future in her womb. The path that had brought them here, through accusation and absence, through medical crises and corporate betrayals, had been unimaginably difficult. Yet standing now in the life they had built from those broken pieces, she wouldn't change the journey that had shaped them all into the family they had become. In the library of their chateau, Alexander kept a small notebook, the same one he had once believed was evidence of Elena's betrayal. Now it rested on his desk as a reminder, not of suspicion, but of how easily truth can be twisted by those we trust, how quickly pride can blind us to what matters most. Beside it sat a newer volume, Benjamin's medical journal, tracking his progress through treatment and recovery, a chronicle of hope overtaking fear, of science creating possibilities where none had existed before. And in a quiet drawer, barely noticed among more practical documents, lay a third record, the portfolio of evidence Elena had presented that fateful wedding day. They kept it not out of bitterness or lingering anger, but as testimony to how completely life can change in a single moment of courage, when truth finally emerges after years of careful silence. When a woman returns not just with a child, but with a revelation capable of destroying everything, or of building something far more valuable from the ruins. The empire Alexander had once thought defined him continued, restructured, and ethically strengthened after Philip's betrayal. Reed Enterprises thrived under the leadership team he had assembled, his strategic guidance now balanced with a perspective that valued people above profits. The board had adjusted to his new priorities, his partial remove from daily operations, his insistence on values beyond the bottom line. Some traditions were worth preserving, others needed to evolve. Alexander had finally learned to distinguish between them. In time, Benjamin would understand the full story of how his parents found their way back to each other, how his existence had transformed his father from corporate automaton to human being, how his mother's courage had saved not just his health, but the legacy that would one day be his responsibility. For now, he simply thrived in the love that surrounded him, in the security of knowing both parents would move heaven and earth to protect him, in the ordinary magic of family life that once seemed impossibly out of reach. Elena and Alexander never forgot how fragile happiness can be, how quickly certainty can shatter, how completely life can change with a single revelation or diagnosis. That awareness made each ordinary day more precious, each family dinner, each shared bedtime ritual, each small domestic moment that most people take for granted. They had lost and found each other against impossible odds, had created a family from the broken pieces of betrayal and misunderstanding, had built something true from the ruins of what pride and manipulation had destroyed. And in the end, that was the real fortune. Not the billions in Alexander's accounts or the global reach of the Reed name, but the second chance they had all been given. The opportunity to rewrite a story that had nearly ended in tragedy. The miracle of truth finally heard, of love finally recognized, of family finally found, a wealth beyond measurement, beyond price, beyond loss.